Okay, let's talk about focal length. Now, focal length is the distance in millimeters from your camera sensor to your camera lens. So that little millimeter, all that's telling you is that distance. That's not really important. What is important is the effect it has on your image. Essentially, the lower the number is, the wider angle view you're gonna have. And when it's wide, it's gonna make things appear farther away than they really are. Kind of like in your car door mirror when it says images may be larger than they appear or whatever. That's the same effect wide angle lenses have. The higher the number is, like the 70 to 200 millimeter lens, the more narrow your field of view is gonna be, and the closer it's gonna make your subject appear. This video you're seeing right now was filmed at 70 millimeter. And the reason why I chose 70 millimeter for this interview is so that I could compress the space so you couldn't tell that I was in my kitchen. I'm gonna zoom this out now to 24 millimeter so you can see what it would look like if I would have chosen a wider focal length. Now we are at 24 millimeter. You can see my table, you can see the lights, you can see the ceiling. You can see a lot of things that I don't want you to be seeing. And that's why I didn't choose to use a wide angle in this, because none of this stuff has importance in this interview. So let's compress that space and go back up to 70 millimeter. And you can no longer tell that I'm in my kitchen and you can't see all the junk around me. So I put together a series of photos that I took of my buddy Tanner Townsend, and I shot each photo at a different focal length, starting at 16 millimeter all the way up to 200 millimeter, so you can see the different effects that each focal length has on the human face. So the first photo I took was at 16 millimeter. I'm literally 6 inches away from his face when I'm shooting this photo. Because my angle is so wide, I have to get really close to make him look big in the image. So when you do that, it distorts all the features of his face. It pulls his nose forward. You can see how big his hat looks. Also notice the compression, or how far away the tree looks behind him in comparison to these next photos. Let's go up now to 20 millimeter, and you see it's slightly less distorted and the background tree's gotten a little bit closer, but it's still way too wide. So let's now go up to 35. The face is starting to look a little more normal now, and that tree is coming even closer as I compress more space, but in my opinion, we're still too wide to be this close to someone's face. So let's go up now to 50 millimeter, and 50 millimeter is the focal length that is said to replicate the human eye, or what you see at 50 millimeter is going to be very similar to what you would see as far as distance goes with your own eye. And that's probably as low as I'd go when shooting close-ups on people's faces. So let's go up now to 70 millimeter. Most photographers will tell you that between 70 and 100 millimeter is the optimal focal length to shoot the human face. So there's 70, 85, and 100. Now let's go up to 135 and then 200. And you see now we're kind of compressing a little too much. The features on the face are now flattened and the face is actually getting a little bit wider. So if you're shooting at too wide of an angle, it makes the face look too skinny and pulled back. Or if you go too tight or too narrow of a focal length, it starts to compress the face and widen it out. So there's kind of a sweet spot, like I said, between 70 and 100 that I think is optimal for showing close-ups of the human face. Now notice also at 200 millimeter how close that tree now looks compared to 16 millimeter. Whereas the wide 16 millimeter is expanding space, that 200 millimeter is compressing space and making everything feel closer. So take a look at these photos now played back to back, and you'll see as it goes back and forth from 16 to 200 millimeter, that background gets closer and farther away. Closer and farther away. And the features on that face are getting skinnier and more distorted, and then wider and more compressed. So keep those two things in mind when choosing your focal length. Understand what the focal length does of expanding space and giving you a bigger field of view, and compressing space and giving you a more narrow field of view. So now that you kind of grasp the concept of what different millimeters and numbers mean and what they're doing to your image, let's talk now about when to use different focal lengths in which situations. First up is the wide angle lens, my 16 to 35. This is the lens I used with Devin Supertramp on 90% of his shoots, on 90% of the shots we took. So if you want to try and replicate Devin Supertramp style, you're gonna want a wide angle lens. With this lens all the way zoomed out at 16 millimeter, all the way wide, I love using this focal length for landscapes as it expands the space around me and allows the viewer to see more of my surroundings. And in the art of cinematography, it's all about perspective. You want to give the viewer the best possible perspective you can to help tell your story. So I'll often use this focal length to start off a video to help establish a location, showing the wide field of view so the viewer can see everything that's in the surrounding location. Another great time to use this is for architecture. Buildings will look a lot bigger when using wide angle lenses. And whenever I shoot real estate videos, I'm always shooting 16mm wide to make the rooms feel more spacious, like they're bigger than they really are. And lastly, I love shooting at 16mm for that in-your-face, super close to the action, sports, and activities. This is the trademark of Devin Supertramp videos, is putting on your wide-angle lens, getting as close as you can to the action, and making it feel like you're there, a part of it. The times when I find myself zooming in to 35mm on this lens is usually when I want to focus just on the top or bottom of my subject. I like to stop down to 2.8 to give me a nice shallow depth of field, separating my subject from my background, but still allowing me to see a lot of the background because we're still pretty wide at 35mm. So I try to stay at least 3 or 4 feet away with this lens so I'm not distorting facial features. Moving up to 50mm, like I said, this is to replicate the human eye. So this is a focal length I love using for stuff like music videos, especially handheld ones where I want it to feel like you're just there watching the performance live. 50mm is a very popular focal length for that documentary, storytelling type vibe. So it almost doesn't feel like you're watching a movie per se, but rather like you're just there in person. Moving on to 70mm, I recently shot a wedding where anytime I was focusing on the bride and groom's face, close-ups of them hugging and holding and kissing and whatever, I always was zoomed into 70mm to give them the most flattering focal length on their face to make all their facial features look their best. And like I said, between 70 and 100 is kind of that optimal zone for close-ups on people's faces. It's a great zone to be in for portraits, and in this case, shooting a wedding video looks absolutely beautiful. Going up to 200mm now, the main reasons I shoot at 200mm is usually because I can't get very close to my subject, so in order to fill the frame with the subject, I have to zoom in all the way to 200 to compress that space and make the subject feel like they're closer as they're filling my frame. On this waterfall shot, I was standing 100 meters away, but it feels like I'm a lot closer because I zoomed in and compressed that space. I also like to use higher focal lengths when it's raining or snowing because when you compress that space, you can see all those individual drops of snow and water, and they show up a lot better when you're using tighter focal lengths. And anytime your background isn't very exciting or pleasing, like right now, I'm zooming in nice and tight to give you a narrow field of view so that you can't see anything else. If you don't have anything good to see in your wide view, don't use a wide angle. Pop something tight on there so you can focus in on just what you want to focus in on. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of when to use different focal lengths and which situations. I want to now walk you through a few videos and show you shot by shot which focal length I chose and why, to give you a good idea in different types of videos why you would choose certain focal lengths. So first, let's start with an action sports example. We'll do my video I shot for Devin Supertramp, the cliff slip and slide in Lake Powell. You got your 16mm establishing shot, the 16mm in the action shot, 35 half body, 16 in the action, again staying wide to be as close as I can to the action, 35 half body, 14mm is the focal length of a GoPro. A little bit tighter at 24 for this in-action shot. Back to 16 wide to show the whole cliff. Compressed at 200 from the other side of the lake. 14 GoPro, 70 side shot, and 70 again for a tight on the face. The next video I'll step you through is a wedding video I recently shot, and you'll see my different focal length choices based on my subject and the type of video I'm making as compared to the action sport video you just saw. Opening shot 16mm to establish location. Here's a 35 establishing location. 50mm to focus in on bottom half details. 16 wide to get the whole temple in the shot. 70mm for this close-up and to make her facial features look flattering. And again for a close-up detail. 16mm to show location. 70 for flattering facial features. 24 so I can get the whole group in the shot, and back to 70mm to show all these close-up shots of the bride and groom, focusing on their facial expressions. Cut to 24 to show the whole temple, and zoomed in back to 70 to give the most flattering look for the facial features of our bride and groom. And now let's take a look at a nature culture piece I shot in Guatemala so you can see my focal lengths that I chose to use in this video and why. Like I said, for landscape photography, I like to shoot 16mm wide to be able to capture as much of the landscape as possible. to give the viewer a good idea of what it looks like to actually be there. 35 half body allows me to focus on the girl while still seeing enough wide landscape in the background. 16 wide shot out of the side of a helicopter, zoomed all the way in at 200 so as not to distract the kids from having fun, so I could capture a very candid moment without them knowing I was even there. 16mm wide to show the landscape. 35 half body to show the action. Again, zoomed in at 200mm so as to get people's natural reactions. 35 half body showing the action. 16 wide to show the landscape. 50mm landscape to compress the background to make the volcano look bigger. 35 landscape from a helicopter, and some more 16mm landscapes. So as you can see, I tend to favor my wide angle lens with the action sports video. I tend to favor my standard lens, my 24-70, in my wedding video because I'm focusing a lot more on people's faces. And then you see my nature culture piece is kind of a mix of the two because I'm doing a lot of landscapes and I'm shooting a lot of people. So hopefully that gives you guys a pretty good idea of what different focal lengths do to your image, the effects they have, the perspective they give the viewer, and some of the reasons why and when you would want to use different focal lengths. So that's about all I got for focal length and lens choice. If you guys have any further questions, please let me know.